Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Charlotte Gallagher, and today we're joined by our Africa correspondent, Barbara Pletuscher, who's in Nairobi. Barbara, it's now 3 years since the start of the civil war in Sudan. The UN says it's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now. You've been there. What's going on the ground?
It's absolutely staggering. 33.7 million people are in need of some form of humanitarian aid. That's food, that's water, that's medicine, that's shelter. You have, especially in the conflict zones, pockets of famine, millions of people existing on only one meal a day. You have nearly 12 million people who have been forcibly displaced. That's both inside and outside the country. You have civilians having suffered from atrocities, especially when one side takes territory from the other, and especially, as we've heard many times, the paramilitary rapid support forces taking over cities like Al Fasher. An increase in drone warfare, so you see more and more civilians being killed by drones. And you have nearly 12 million people, mostly women and girls, that are at risk of rape. Now, that figure has increased by around 350% since the beginning of the war.
And you mentioned drones earlier, Barbara. Where are they coming from and who's supplying these weapons?
So there has been an increase in drone warfare over the past year in particular, I would say. Both sides have them. The Rapid Support Forces is being armed by the United Arab Emirates, so it's getting supplies funneled from the United Arab Emirates through neighboring countries to Sudan. Now, the UAE denies this, but there's a lot of evidence for it. The Sudanese Armed Forces have an air force, so they had been using airplanes, warplanes, to carry out military strikes, but they have also increasingly been using drones. And from what we understand, they got some drones from Iran last year, or the year before, but now they're getting a lot of them from Turkey, again, quite sophisticated.
And given, Barbara, the scale of the suffering that you've outlined there, and we've heard from the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk saying that his warnings haven't been heeded, why do you think there hasn't been that attention and also action from world leaders?
Well, I think part of it is a bandwidth issue because other conflicts have taken precedence. So you've had Ukraine, you've had Gaza, you have Iran now, and Sudan hasn't been getting that kind of top-level diplomatic and government attention. I think there is an impression that it is not as geopolitically significant as some of those other conflicts. So there is that. I think also it's important to say that there have been a lot of UN meetings, UN resolutions, UN investigations, UN statements. So there's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of discussion, there's been a lot of criticism. The United States has taken on board trying to get a ceasefire. So there's a U.S. envoy, Masad Boulos, who's been trying very hard to get a peace deal or at least a humanitarian ceasefire. So there has been work involved, but it hasn't been successful. The RSF is supported by the United Arab Emirates, although the UAE denies that. The army side, the Sudanese-led government, doesn't have a single patron in the same way, but it does have support from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, and that support has been increasing and increasingly open. And so they are getting supplies that allow them to keep fighting. Now, that would be the source of trying to push the two parties together towards an agreement. Now, that isn't happening for several reasons. One, there's no pressure on these external backers to force them to stop the supply of weapons. And analysts say that's because they have very good diplomatic and investment relations with the West, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's one. Two, though, is that you need these parties at the table in the room to be able to help come up with a peace plan that will work. And in fact, they are at the table. There's a mechanism called the Quad, which is the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. And they have talked about a peace plan. They put it forward. But they have not backed that with the high-level diplomacy forcing the two sides to accept it. And here, the army has been a stickler because the chief of the army keeps saying, we will not even negotiate unless the RSF withdraws from the cities that it has taken, unless it goes to designated areas and disarms, in effect, surrenders.
Barbara, last year, President Trump said he would start working on Sudan. And you mentioned that there is a US envoy there trying to bring people together, the parties together. How much does a ceasefire, any lasting kind of peace, sort of hinge on the US being involved? And also, as you mentioned earlier, it's the bandwidth issue. I mean, the US has Iran, had Venezuela. There's also involvement in Ukraine. There is just so much going on.
We haven't seen any personal involvement from President Trump. And yes, there is a bandwidth issue, especially with the Iran war now. But he has his envoy, and that envoy has continued to work. So that envoy was also very instrumental in working together with this mechanism called the Quad, which was Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. That started before the Trump administration. The Americans have been working with this group. And the recognition there is you need these outside actors in order to create an effective possibility for peace. Now, they put out this peace agreement last September, and it was seen as, finally, we've got a document, something that says this is what should happen and a little bit about how we should get there. That was the first time it had happened, but that hasn't gone anywhere. You've had the RSF give verbal acceptance of parts of it, but what analysts say is they know that the army isn't prepared to negotiate on these terms, and so it's sort of safe for them to do that. So it's a very complicated picture. You don't have top-level, high-pressure diplomacy on this. You don't have it from the US, and you don't have it from the external backers at this point.
And at the heart of this, you've got civilians in Sudan who no doubt feel totally desperate and totally forgotten by the rest of the world.
Yes, I think that's very true. I mean, there have been attempts by the UN, by humanitarian agencies, and so on to try to get aid in, to try to raise the profile. But the experience of people on the ground is that life is just getting worse and worse. We had contact with a journalist who'd been in the city of El Fasher, which was under RSF siege for quite a long time. And then you had this very bloody and tumultuous takeover of the city last October. And he said, there is no international law. There is no real world. I mean, there's no UN. If there were international human rights organizations, I wouldn't have seen what I saw in Al Fasher for all those years. I wouldn't have seen the starving and the killing and all the rest of it. So that was quite a disillusioned statement. Having said that, I do want to highlight that the Sudanese, there's a lot of resilience in Sudan, and you have local groups, they're called emergency response rooms. You also have community kitchens, people on the ground doing what they can to help their fellow citizens. And it's not just with food, it's with emergency help, it's with medical help, all kinds of things. They have been getting a lot of money from the diaspora, the Sudanese diaspora, as well as, at least in the beginning of the conflict, they were using their own money. But they're running out of money too. And so there has been this move by the UN agencies and the international agencies to say, let's get more of the donor money that we have to these people, because they're on the ground and they're able to actually get access to the people. So you do see a lot of bravery, but you also see a lot of despair.
Thanks, Barbara. That was the BBC's Africa correspondent, Barbara Pletusha, in Nairobi. And if you would like to hear more from the Global News podcast, you can click the link below. Thanks so much for watching.